Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Jeroen Klink. I'm a professor at the Federal University of the ABC region. And I'm very pleased to host, together with Joe Shaw from the Urban Studies Foundation, this second event already of the Urban Studies Foundation seminar series, which is entitled States, Markets, and Variegated Urban Growth Machines. In order to start our event, I would like to pass on the floor directly to Joe Shaw in order to provide some background information regarding the Urban Studies Foundation and the context of this event. Please, Joe.
Thank you, Jeroen. So welcome everyone to our second USF International Workshop. As Jeroen said, this is being very kindly hosted by the Federal University of the ABC region in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Thanks to Jeroen, but also to Julia and Isabella at UFABC for their excellent support in organising this event. And thanks to you all for attending. Jeroen will shortly introduce our speakers to you all, but just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Joe Shaw, the Director of Operations at the USF, or Urban Studies Foundation. For those of you who do not know much about the Urban Studies Foundation, we're a charitable organisation based in Glasgow, Scotland, and our core aims and objectives are to advance research, education and knowledge transfer in the field of urban studies. Important to say today, we are also a globally oriented organisation with a firm commitment to redistributing our resources across international borders. And we do this via several core grant-making schemes, all of which are focused on criteria of research excellence, combined with a strong commitment to values of equality and diversity within the urban studies community at large, and also with a focus on the role of our grants within wider networks and contexts of academic knowledge production. So with specific reference today, as part of this, we've been running our international fellowships for scholars from and working in the Global South for the best part of a decade now. This is a specific grant award that all of today's speakers have or will benefit from, and the award focuses on supporting scholars in the publication of their research, amongst other things. For more information on that particular fellowship and our other grants, please have a look at our website, urbanstudiesfoundation.org, and also feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions about our grant schemes. Meanwhile, just a few quick words about today's workshop. Although we are a relatively young organisation, we're actually only established in 2008, we're also growing quite rapidly, which means that our network of fellows and alumni around the world is expanding all the time. And as part of that, we've been exploring different ways in which we can bring our fellows together across different regions and research fields, which is obviously particularly hard post-pandemic. But we also want to try and strengthen the synergy among the individual research projects of international fellows, which are relatively diverse and, as I said, based all around the world. Also to increase the visibility of the work of the USF research community, with an emphasis on building new knowledge networks that mobilise scholars and reflective practitioners from the global urban South. Not only that, we want to try and communicate and contribute to a truly global urban studies based on research around the specificities of cities in the global South. So as part of these goals and priorities, we are planning several of these workshops in the near future. This is the second of two pilot ones we've done. And so I would encourage all of you present to visit our website, sign up to the mailing list, and keep an eye out on social media for more news on those. So I'll hand you back to Professor Jeroen Klink, who's also one of the USF's 11 trustees, and he will be chairing today's workshop. Thanks, Jeroen.
Thank you very much, Joe. Without further delay, I will briefly introduce each of the four presenters in the order that they will be presenting. First of all, Dr. Melih Yasilbak is a lecturer in the sociology department at the University of Ankara, Turkey. His research examines the political economy of the construction boom in Turkey under the AKP party rule. Situating Turkey's case into a world historical setting, he offers an analytical framework that addresses the causes and the consequences of the construction drive. He will be presenting actually a paper which has been produced during his period he spent with the Urban Studies Foundation, and the paper is just being published in October in the Urban Studies Journal. Dr. Dinora Gonzalez is a professor researcher in the area of urban planning, economic development, and housing. She's an urban planner with experience in the design, implementation, and evaluation of urban public policies. This includes using geographic information systems as a tool of analysis for decision making in the public administration. Her presentation is being developed, which has been developed, will focus on speculative housing and the urban landscape, a case study of Tijuana, Mexico. And then Professor Dr. Beatriz Rufino is a professor and researcher at the College of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of Sao Paulo, and a member of LABIHAB, the Laboratory of Housing and Human Settlements. Is a key player in the research community in Brazil. Her recent research is focused on the financialization of space production, seeking to develop a critical understanding of the particularities in increasing commodification of the metropolitan areas of Brazil and Latin America. Her presentation will focus on the more recent developments in her broader work on urban infrastructure financialization under the developmental state. And last but not least, Dr. Daniel San Felici is a professor of economic geography at the graduate program in geography at the University Federal Fluminense in Brazil. He holds a master's degree and a PhD at the University of Sao Paulo. He was also Fulbright visiting scholar at the City University of New York. Over the past years, Dr. San Felici's work has focused on the growing entanglements between real estate and financial markets in Brazil. His period, he will start actually next year, so we have a nice variety of profiles, people who have done work and people who will start actually their work, such as Daniel. He will focus, and probably his presentation will also draw on this, he will focus on financial market investors in Brazil's commercial real estate, typology of actor strategy, and social spatial impacts. Each of the presenters will have 15 to 20 minutes. Last but not least, two more details. The logistics. Julia has warned me to remind you that everyone can send questions during the presentations through the chat system. And also there is a form, you can fill that in order to receive registration and a certificate for anyone who needs that. And finally, that's really the last remark I will make before passing on the floor to Melih. This event wouldn't have been possible without support, of course, from the Urban Studies Foundation, and particularly Joe Shaw. Despite the fact that he has a flu, he is always everywhere present and always trying to help. Thank you, Joe. And Julia, who has helped me throughout this process, and the people from the Community Extension Services Department of the UFABC, Isabella and others. Thank you very much. And without further delay, I give the floor to Professor Melih, please.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I would like to thank USF and the organizing team for this possibility. It's a pleasure. So I'll be talking about the consequences, the causes and the consequences of the construction drive in Turkey, and I'll try to relate this issue within the broad literature on land-based accumulation. Here I'm sharing my slides. Okay, I think you can see it. Okay, so land-based accumulation is an issue that is being increasingly discussed as a feature of contemporary capitalism, and we now know, thanks to this literature, we now know how land is tied to global circles of capital, and how capital actually increasingly emphasizes land, and how land becomes an issue of accumulation more and more across the globe. But within this literature, when the role of the state, somehow remains still controversial. When you look at the earlier works, what we see is mostly a passive state, which is losing ground against capital, so to speak, through deregulation and rollback. But recent work started to recognize the role of the proactive role of the state in land-based accumulations, and started to emphasize how actually states initiated and implemented and formulated land-based accumulation strategies by themselves. So states are not considered as passive facilitators, but mostly drivers of LBA in those recent studies. And this takes us to the question: what is the rationale behind this state involvement in land-based accumulation? Why do states pursue land-based accumulation strategies? Why do we see more often these processes in general? Of course, there are some obvious macroeconomic goals. States do this to attract global capital. They stimulate rapid growth through built environment practices and construction industry and so on, which is also good for creating jobs. But beyond those obvious macroeconomic goals, there is actually another dimension to this, which is probably less obvious. That states can mobilize land-based accumulation to advance their own distinct political agendas. It can be incorporated into the establishment of the political system in a given place. So my research focused on this less obvious part and asked the question: can we talk about a politics of land-based accumulation? How about we know about the economy politic of land-based accumulation more or less, but how about the directly political dimensions of land-based accumulations in general? So if you look at that, actually, this is if you look at the literature with those concerns, we see that there is a strand that goes way back, and the studies on growth machines and urban regime theory actually have theorized how politics is enmeshed within property relations and built environment practices in general. And there are a few other works here and there. For instance, McCormack's work on the politics behind the Japanese property bubble, how a coalition of builders and financiers and politicians have actually had a dramatic role in the perhaps one of the biggest property bubbles of the recent times. And we also have, of course, Haila's works on Singapore and Hong Kong, and how actually the state, how these political formations are actually built around property, and how they are defined as property states. And recently, Dubai has been scrutinized along these lines, and the property boom in Dubai by Buckley and Hania's study tells us that actually the boom here is not just a matter of a capital switch, but it's actually a component of the diversification agenda of the state over there. And lastly, Shopkin's work talks about the overall real estate turn in Asia, and how states monetize land in a growing fashion, and how actually they mobilize these resources coming from the monetization of land for their own political agendas, and how it differs from region to region. So I try to build on that literature, and in conversation with this strand of the literature, I try to look at the Turkish case and ask the question if contemporary Turkey can be seen as an instance of land-based accumulation. And I'll give some figures concerning that. The AKP, the Justice and Development Party, came to power in 2002 and still in power these days. So it's been almost 2 decades now, and a very peculiar, a very interesting dimension of the AKP rule is that there has been a massive construction boom during this era. That from 2002 to now, actually 9.2 million dwelling units have been added to the stock. This roughly makes 1/3 of the total housing stock as of now. So it's really huge in every dimension. And to give it in a comparative basis, 7.4 million building permits, which of course mean construction starts. 7.4 million building permits have been issued in the given period, 2006 to 2017, and this is more than half of all EU countries combined. And another dimension is that construction has had a very significant share in the domestic economy. Its value added as of 2017 was 9.8, whereas the EU average was 5.23 in this time. And there was also a massive mega project drive, which made Turkey a leading actor in Europe in terms of public-private partnerships. Here are some figures that we can see these trends. Here, the blue line, the darker blue, represents Turkey, and this is the share of construction in total value added. As you see, Turkey is way over the average, and it is actually the top country in terms of this indicator in 2016 and 17, and by far so. And it is actually the rate 9.8 is actually close to Ireland and Spain, which were of course very countries that had housing and construction related problems during the 2008 crisis. I mean, they experienced these problems much more heavily than the rest of Europe, which had construction boom and bust cycles, and in a very harmful way, of course. So Turkey is not very far away from those examples. This also shows the building permits and occupancy permits between in the last 4 decades. So AKP comes to power in 2002. The blue ones refer to the building permits, so construction starts, and the other ones, the red ones, are occupancy permits, which refer to construction finishes, construction completion. As you see, since 2002, there is a very remarkable rise in both indicators. We see a kind of a slowdown, cooling down after 2018. But in general, the situation is unmatched, both compared to other previous periods of Turkey, but also to other countries that I mentioned previously. So to global averages in general. So Turkey is indeed has gone through a very major construction boom in this period, and this shows the Turkish PPP markets, Turkish share in public-private partnership markets. Due to this mega project drive, only in 2014 and 2018, Turkey had a remarkable position within these markets as well. And in the following years, this is also an ongoing trend. So, my next question is, how has this construction boom actually been possible? And if you look at the more mainstream or like market representatives, usually they say that, okay, well, this is actually a natural market response under favorable conditions. There was demand and there was supply, so here it is. But actually, the construction area, the built environment production area, actually has been one of the areas that have been that has been heavily intervened by the AKP governments. There have been a series of strategic interventions into the sector, and one of them was the transformation of the mass housing administration, which was like a small, ordinary, modest state bureau and it was transformed into a super institution equipped with immense regulatory and financial power, and also immunity from audit processes within the state. And it has become sort of like the headquarters of the government's housing drive. There have been again several rounds of legal changes concerning land development and urban planning. There has been a very massive urban transformation project or urban transformation agenda to replace and rebuild old and substandard units and so on. There has been, for the first time in Turkey, the mortgage system has been introduced in 2007, and there have been several legal changes that has facilitated the expansion of real estate investment trust markets, which actually which actually signifies the emergence of a real estate finance nexus for the first time, perhaps in Turkey. And there has been, as I said, a persistent stream of mega projects all across the country, mostly focused on Istanbul and the third bridge and the third airport, which is now the new Istanbul airport, which is actually by far the biggest in Turkey, in the world actually, in terms of capacity and all, are examples of this. And right now there is this talk about another major mega project, Kanal Istanbul, which is actually to make an artificial second Bosphorus, parallel to Bosphorus. This is now not under construction yet, but this is another wave of it. So the summary is that AKP has strategically and massively intervened in the built environment scene. And I think that story is not merely just yet another unfolding of a capital switch per se. Of course, there is this dimension, and this has been possible through those global trends. But I think that we need to look at the politics of that strategy and try to understand what were the motivations behind, what were the concerns behind this land-based accumulation strategy. So what I try to actually see here is that I try to say that the construction drive, the land-based accumulation, were very much integrated into the new hegemonic project of the AKP, which is actually a blend of neoliberalism and Islamism, so to speak. And the construction drive had a major dimension here. First, concerning the power balance within the Turkish bourgeoisie, Turkish capitalist class, and the construction boom was very much useful for creating a generation of firms in the sector which were tightly linked with the ruling party. And we can see this, as I'll show now, during the AKP era, the top league of the construction industry underwent a total transplantation. And what we saw was that the leading firms of the previous era were gone out of the sector, of the domestic sector, and they were replaced by a new generation of firms, which all happen to have organic ties to the AKP. And what we see is not just just an instance of clientelism. Of course, it is. There is this dimension, but what we can, it is not one way of party nurturing certain capital groups, which is perhaps more often seen everywhere. But what I try to argue is that there is a party capital complex in this situation, and the party grants certain privileges to a select group of capitalists. So that these capitalists become totally connected to the party, and they are becoming dependent on the party, and then they endorse the party for the political campaigns, contribute financially to the party politics through several informal mechanisms. And the other dimension is that the construction drive of AKP has been abundantly instrumentalized for the ideological strategies of the party to manufacture mass consent and so on. Here is some empirical info that shows how actually the AKP uses these powers to change the to change the accumulation. Oops.
Meli, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
You still have 5 minutes, right?
Okay,
Sorry.
yeah, I just saw. Okay, thanks. So this table shows the top 10 contractors in the NIR list, and highlighted ones are firms that are actually politically connected firms to the AKP government. I use this I use the methodology for politically connected firms in the literature. And I try to find evidence to differentiate between firms. In this list, the top 10 firms, there's actually only 2 that are not politically connected firms, and those 2 are foreign firms. One of them is a Chinese firm, and the other one is an Italian firm. And the rest of the firms all happen to have very tight and intimate relations with the AKP government through several mechanisms. I document this in the paper, but they are tightly linked to the party, and none of them has been actually major actors in the sector before the emergence of the AKP. Plus, if you look at the first 5, you see that the first 5 has been there for quite some time. Their ranking changes within them, but they are there. And these first 5 firms actually happen to be the largest firms in terms of state contracts across the world, in the whole world, according to a survey of a UN affiliate organization. So there is a massive construction boom, and there's a massive resources that are channeled to these specific firms, and these are part of the political economy structure of the AKP period. And let me go to the other one. The other issue is, as I said, construction drive and products of the construction drive actually have been abundantly instrumentalized for the AKP strategy. Actually, the 2011 election campaign was almost totally only shaped around the construction drive. So this is actually a very instrumental, a very important tool to mobilize the construction drive for political and ideological gains as well. Here are just some examples of that. So from here, I want to conclude. So I try to contribute to the land-based accumulation debate, a dimension of capitalist class formation, and also a dimension of ideological mobilization, a way of manufacturing consent. And I try to, I say that, I argue that the AKP's actually tight grip on power has been based on and has been enabled by this land-based accumulation strategy. It is the defining element behind the AKP's political economical machinery in general. And it is also it is also probably the main source of the neoliberal authoritarian trajectory of the AKP. And I think that this can be also expanded to a general discussion on the possible linkages between land-based accumulation and neoliberal authoritarianism. So let me stop here, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Professor Meli, for a fascinating presentation. And those of you who want to read the paper, reminding that it's available in the October edition of the Urban Studies Journal. Fascinating. Without further delay, I will give the floor to Professor Dinora Gonzalez. Please, you also have 20 minutes. And Julia and I will warn you after 15 minutes that you have still 5 minutes to wrap up your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Before I begin, I would like to thank the USF and Joe Shaw for this opportunity. I also want to thank the Latin American Cities Initiative, and a special thanks to the UFABC and Professor Clint and Juliana Mateo for organizing today's session. Today I present speculative housing production and the urban landscape. This is a case study that I have been working on for Tijuana, Mexico. Tijuana, I would like to talk a little bit about it. It's the fifth largest metropolitan region in Mexico. It's a city located at the northern part of Mexico, and it borders with the United States of America. So it's a very dynamic, economically dynamic part of the country. Okay, in this presentation, I'll provide a little bit of background on how financial reform fueled the housing markets and changed the way cities grow in Mexico. Mainly, we see them grow through segmented housing products offered by large developers. I set up the hypothesis of how I believe developers' production strategies explain the new urban landscape. And I will focus for this presentation on two analyses that I set out, which is scale economies in construction and how these are imperative in low-cost housing production. And I also assess factor substitution, where land inputs can be substituted by constructing taller buildings and how these affect overall production prices. At the end, I will address just slightly the role of flexible planning and offer some conclusions. Well, as in other countries around the world, financialization was this part of the neoliberal structural reforms implemented by nation states during the 1980s, 1990s through the recommendation of international financial organizations. I mean, we just saw what Melich presented of how the mass housing administration implemented in Turkey. In Brazil, well, we have Minha na Casa Minha Vida. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I'm sure you will correct me. But for Mexico, this was implemented through the National Workers' Housing Fund. And these changes took effect during the first part of the 21st century. This newly formed financial system was the basis of this federal housing policy, destined to increase access to formal housing and complete housing. This is a home built with durable materials and with basic public services. Through the advent of subsidized mortgages, this fueled speculative house building. These are companies that produce affordable housing that grew considerably during this time. They grew into large firms with presence in different cities around the country with high housing demand. These companies also diversified, attending other market segments, not just low-income housing, such as middle-income housing and residential housing. While informal housing is still a relevant part of how our cities grow, we can see the data on speculative housing production shows us that for the last 20 years, private companies have produced around 72% of new housing in Mexico. This is what different authors refer to as the housing transition. Which describes a shift in housing construction from mainly incremental housing to one headed by private companies. Through this federal housing policy, the first decade of speculative housing production was primarily driven by mortgage secured demand. For this period, the urban form, the constructed space, was characterized by suburban low-income housing that appeared in these cities with high formal employment levels. Tijuana is one of those cities with a great number of potential buyers due to the presence of assembly plants, or what we call maquiladoras. And through this policy, workers that earning around roughly less than $350 US dollars could qualify for a subsidized mortgage. While this housing policy allowed thousands of families to become homeowners, different studies have also shown that this type of growth contributes to overcrowding, segregation, higher living costs, and other phenomena that just deepen socioeconomic differences. On the other front, well, we see that speculative housing is also generating another dynamic. And this one, we can exemplify it through the other part of the income spectrum. And we can see this with the recent housing boom also in Tijuana and in other cities in Mexico with large, high GDPs. And this is the luxury apartment housing boom that is very recent. And this demand is been said to it's been attributed to the demand for high yield investment opportunities. And right now, we can see that luxury apartments in the city of Tijuana comprise around 19% of the total housing stock, yet they're only aimed at less than 1% of the population who can really afford them. And the problem that arises at this moment is that they are bidding up land prices in central locations, making it even more difficult to produce or to have affordable housing. Well, the difference among segments are more apparent when we analyze the location pattern. Here we have a map of Tijuana with buffers around the central business district and the location of segmented housing developments produced from 2010 to 2020. And we can see that low-income housing, which tops at $26,000, is located mostly in suburban areas, while residential and residential plus housing, which is all that housing above $100,000, are mainly located near economic centers and sub-centers, nearer to employment opportunities, services, and other urban commodities, while middle-income housing is located somewhere in between. So with this in mind, the research question that I propose is, why does speculative housing produce such a segregated and polarized urban form? My hypothesis, and this is something that I have been working on, is that the urban form results from housing developers' strategies that seek to either minimize costs or maximize sales. And to explain this, we can start by saying that speculative housing developers design and build real estate for an aggregated demand. They summarize buyers' preferences and their design in their design and location choices. So I hypothesize that to reduce uncertainty in producing housing that yields low capital gains, developers employ cost reduction strategies. Such is the case of low-income housing production, where developers reduce costs by buying inexpensive suburban land producing with scale economies, and reducing the size of housing and public spaces to the minimums required by urban regulation. These are necessary in order to produce a home that can sell for around $20,000. Additionally, developers avoid production diseconomies by building low-height constructions. For social housing, this explains why the urban form is dense, compact, and has little use diversity. As gains, what we can see is that as gains on investment increase, so does competition. And this competition is for the higher income market segments. Developers then seek better locations for those developments and introduce different types of amenities that can help them maximize sales, such as a larger house, more parking spaces that are required by law, recreational areas, and other amenities. All these decisions lead to location and the location and form of these urban developments, and together they comprise the urban form, which is this polarized pattern that we saw on the map. For the analysis and data, I broke down the hypothesis into 5 statistic regressions through which I assess how production strategies determine different aspects of the urban form. For this presentation, I will show results of only 2. The first is a direct assessment of scale economies using production cost and production volume, data on production cost and production volume for 89 housing prototypes. The second is my assessment of how factor substitution, which is substituting land inputs with machinery, labor, and materials, impacts housing production costs. In short, this regression assesses how building height increases production costs, canceling any savings from optimizing land inputs. These findings, I interpret them with statistic analysis of housing production characteristics. And here is the results on scale economies. We can see that scale economies are represented through diminishing returns to scale, while using a constant technology. As scale increases, marginal production costs decrease. I operationalize this concept by separating my data into 2 construction technologies: masonry blocks and concrete casing technology, which was developed and widely used during the housing boom. As the figure shows, the latter represents a technological shift that yields scale economies. With this implementation, developers could build a home in a day, while masonry block construction is more labor intensive, prone to human error, and did not show any scale economies during construction. These results shows us, or rather we can see that the scale of production needed to exhaust fixed cost of this construction technique leads us to the location decisions and development in the size of the development in low-income housing developments. Big lots are needed to ensure long-term production, and these can only be found in suburban locations. Additionally, we can see that with this technology, one cast renders around 1,500 homes. So we can also attribute the uniform landscape as another consequence of this production decision. And this is an example of what I'm talking about, of the construction, the construction technology. For factor substitution, economic theory postulates that where land is scarce and demand is high, a developer can substitute land inputs with machinery, labor, materials to produce more sellable surface. In short, this means that land inputs can be optimized by constructing a taller building. Empirical evidence for the UK and Hong Kong has long showed that as building height increases, so do building costs. And this happens after a certain threshold in height. For Tijuana, we found that cost for construction inputs significantly change after 4 floors. This is a height where the local building code requires elevators. So it was expected that we would have a difference at that point. These price increases when constructing when constructing taller buildings is one of the reasons low-income housing it does not exceed the 4 floors in this city.
Ginora, sorry,
yes?
You have still 5 minutes.
Okay,
sorry
perfect.
to interrupt.
It's fine. Okay, so when we analyze the development statistics, we can clearly see that the urban form is clearly built on these premises. Because of scale economies, low-income developments are extremely large. We can see that there are around 7,000 homes on average, and they're located far away from the central business district, like around 14 kilometers. In areas with little employment opportunities. On the other hand, as income rises, developments notably differ in location as you get nearer to the central business district. The home that they offer is also larger. There are more parking spaces provided than those required by the building code. All these decisions are dictated by demand preferences. In addition, these homes are more likely to be located in taller buildings. With the data that we can see that for developers, building in height only makes sense if the product is directed at high-income buyers. This restricts the ability of providing housing in more central locations for lower income population. Additionally, if we add the notion that very low cost housing relies on scale economies in productions, which require these large suburban lots, we can see why these two restrictions on low-cost housing production explain why housing policy has failed in every attempt to redirect low-income housing to more central locations. And just briefly, I would like to say that this quantitative analysis, I assess these developers' decisions without considering planning restrictions. There's a reason for this. With financial reform came flexibility of the planning instruments, and according to municipal law, developers can require modifications to these zoning ordinances, and most of them do. This, in recent years, have fueled community organized opposition to zoning changes. These communities claim their rights to zoning ordinances in order to preserve their quality of life, and they also claim the new developments will stress the already overwhelmed infrastructure. Some of these communities have been able to stop, delay, or even modify multi-million-dollar projects through legal action or social mobilization, acting as a kind of counterweight to the complicit actions of governments and markets. Okay, in conclusion, we can see that these analyses of scale economies and factor substitution explain why it is so hard to build inexpensive housing in central locations. We saw how substituting land inputs for building inputs increase overall production cost, and this is one of the reasons high rises are only profitable if directed at high income market segments. For Tijuana, these supply side decisions have led to the concentration of high rises in very few centers and sub-centers. And all of this market-driven segregation pattern, we can see that flexible zoning regulations do exacerbate it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Dinora. While you were presenting, I was thinking a little bit on our Brazilian program, My House, My Life, but I'm sure that there will be feedback on this during the debates. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And please, Professor Beatriz, I would like to give you the floor. You have 20 minutes, and we will warn you after 15 minutes, right?
Right. So I will share my screen. Are you seeing my presentation? Are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, it's
Okay.
It's perfect.
So thank you, Jerome. Good afternoon for all. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here. I do like to thank the UFABC for receiving us, and also Urban Starts Foundation for the fellowship, and also especially to Joe Shaw that has been so supportive for during this whole process. So today I decided to present more or less my proposal to Urban Starts Foundation, and after that present some development doing regarding the two papers that I proposed. So the idea of our proposal is to discuss the urban infrastructure financialization under the Brazilian developmental neoliberalism. So infrastructure production in Brazil has undergone important transformation since the 90s, articulating itself with the country's alignment with a neoliberal agenda. The adoption of counter-cyclical policy in response to 2008 crisis expands and makes the nature of this process even more complex. The development of neoliberalism conducted by a progressive government, Labour Party, legitimate the expansions of investment, but also the expansion of privatization. So this research focuses on understanding the specificities of this dynamic of infrastructure privatization in Brazil and how it is mediated by the subordinated cession of Latin America countries into global economy and by the interests of national elites. With that, we try to discuss the nature and the limits of financialization. We expect it to contribute in expanding the understanding of infrastructure privatization and financialization in Latin America, but also introducing the Brazilian case that has as particularity the domain of large national contractors, and not less important, to critically reflect about the debates of value capture and rent extraction. So our methodology is basically based on gather and analyze secondary source to reconstruct the trajectory of privatization and financialization in Brazil with a variety of sources, including regulation, data analysis, and also interview with company directors, policymakers, unions, and social movements in order to understand the general trajectory of infrastructure financialization and the particular strategy of capital accumulation and the public-private partnerships. All this research has been doing in the last years. It's a collective work. We had also a lot of discussions with our research group, and our intention during this period here in London, under the supervision of Thomas Pusser, who I also thanks a lot, we're trying to develop it theoretically and trying to develop this engagement with this debate about Brazil with the international literature. Our idea is to develop 2 papers, one about more the general process, and then after to finish this discussion about the general process, going in a more specific discussion based in one particular case, trying to bring through the literature some discussion about labor exploitation and social reproductions. To do that, we mobilize in the second paper the concept of double monopoly that was developed by Lefebvre in order to locate how value production, infrastructure as fixed capital, and rent extraction, infrastructure as urban property and financial assets, have been knit together under the creation of new regimes of property. This new regime of property are based in the disciplinary organization of state, space, and labor. We're trying to contribute with more social impact. But today, and also because of the time, we're trying to develop a bit more this paper, in fact, on discussion. It's an ongoing process about the large Brazilian contractors in the make of infrastructure assetization. So the idea in developing this paper is first develop this literature review, trying to approximate it. We argue that it's very important to approximate a more macro discussion with a more micro measure discussion. So we're trying to bring together the subordinate financialization and also the new developmentalism with this more urban infrastructure financialization. What's interesting to see that while subordinate financialization discussion does not see or does not take too much attention to infrastructure financialization, they illuminate how the particular nature of this financialization impose or reinforce structural limits to infrastructure provision, even through financialization. These 2 main characteristics that are very important, this limitation of infrastructure development, are the dependence on short-term financial capital and the high interest rates that also make these economies more prone to crisis. And the crisis of 2008, and then we came to Brazil, while demonstrated this vulnerability of the periphery or the emerging economy, creating Brazil space for implementation of a set of anti-cyclical policies, many of them with strong implications to space production through the increased investment. Here we will focus particularly in infrastructure. This strategy was part supported by economic reserves from the commodity boom in the previous period. All this conjuncture revitalized the debate about new developmentalism, its possibilities and limits. New developmentalists emerged in Latin America in 2000, presumably as an alternative to neoliberalism. Alfredo Saad argues that these policies did not replace the neoliberal policy framework. Instead, they were juxtaposed with the creating a variety of systems of accumulation that can be called development neoliberalism. In a more or less the same sense, Singer, an important Brazilian scholar, said that this strategy could be seen as an attempt to reconcile the opposing coalitions of rentier and productivist, industrial and associate sectors of the economy. For us, this interpretation of duality between the rentier and productive capital tends to be limit high the increased connection with productive enterprise with rentier investment. We argue that even though these policies are being promoted to develop a productive sector, direct or indirectly, they ended up structuring new channels of rent extractions. this put us the necessity to engage with this increased literature about urban financialization, infrastructure financialization, rentier capitalism, and assetization. What we see is that this literature became very important to the discussions of innovations, asset creation, so in many connections about the state and also private and public regulation and tax expenses, highlighting and revealing the important role in the of the financial investors and of financial intermediaries in shaping this process. This is quite important. They will be mobilized to discuss the Brazilian case, but we see some limitations in this literature to connect rentier and value capital with more global accumulation discussion. Recently work more focused on global south, so how this financialization in global south is really connections with process of over accumulations in the global north, but depends of the police interventions of state, the interest of the elite. What we see is a variegated kinds of financialization. All this literature are calling for more grounded studies in the global south. At the same time, the literature of subordination financialization are call for more historical grounded work in social relations and geographical and space, and based in geographical and space discussion. So we go into Brazilian case, trying to situate the emergence of these big companies historically. What is interesting is to see that historical development and transformation of this infrastructure company are really located with this state provision of infrastructure during the developmental period, and when infrastructure was seen as a collective public good necessary for nascent industrialization to the more going further to the more recent phase of transformation of infrastructure into a finance asset. So the large company basically they emerge on the 1930s, 1940s, together with this task assumed by the state to assembling the economic infrastructure to promote industrial development. In this sense, the Brazilian state play a crucial role in the capital accumulation of the national heavy industry from the second half of the 40s to the 80s. By nationalizing the demand, the state produced radical change in the way infrastructures became to be produced. The state institutionalized a series of mechanisms to privilege local firms, such as the creation of local agents, the consolidation of public funds, facilitating the importation of machinery and equipment, but more clearly, during the dictatorship, what we see is this creation, the elimination of the competitions with international company and create a market reserve through law. At the same time, in the 73, with the oil shock and the economic downturn in Brazil, the infrastructure was chosen again as a way to escape the crisis, create entire new markets with the expansion of the investments. What is interesting is that in this tradition to developmentalism, to neoliberalism, this company became stronger through diversification and internationalization. They became important in other sectors, such as in industries such as mine, agriculture, cement, petrochemicals, and steel. At the same time, we see that the sector itself has been chosen as an international representation of Brazilian economy in the time of the globalization. These two drives explain how they became so important during the privatization that initiates in the 90s, as we can see with this graphic, shows the investment with some private participation that we see that will be very limited. And also because with the experience, international experience, they realize how to be much more profitable hold a contract of 25 years and make this for the present time than do only the construction. So they became like a big conglomerates that are very important in the process that we trying to discuss. So this process show how this company passed through a really important process of modernization, became aligned to cooperative governance practice, but also to understand this process is really important to understand the close relation with BNDES, that's our development bank, and also the ambiguous role of this bank, that in the same time remained a kind of most important structure in the development policy, being responsible for subsidized financing and also be partner of some of the company and concessionary companies created by this large developer. But at the same time, they remain the important role that the bank have since the 80s and 90s to promote privatization. So they remain a key driver to promote project finance, this more advanced structure of finance that connect with the revenue of rents of the projects, and also to promote a kind of bonds, it's called in Brazil, debentures. But what's seen if this kind of instrument, it's quite linked with infrastructure, with international practice, they are quite limited. And then the advancement on them in the end was based on the financed subsidies by the BNDES. The BNDES is also central to PPP, a new modality of public-private partnership that extended the possibilities of privatization since they consider another source of counter payments by the state. So some structures, mainly urban infrastructures, that are not seen as profitable, became profitable. So what we see with that is the important process of consolidations of large-scale urban infrastructure as a rent streams through the PPPs. And when we see what kind of project we are talking about, we see the dominance of large Brazilian contractor that is in a completely different structure that we had in the previous years. So the Brazilian dominate the control of the project, and it's quite interesting to see the whole of the Odebrecht, who holds more than 33 projects among the total number of the project. And also what we see is that urban infrastructure project became one of the most important investment, what was also not true in the previous period. But what's interesting...
Sorry, you have still 5 minutes, Beatriz. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, no problem. I'm on time. Thank you. So what's interesting to see about this process, that we have really a process of assetizations with all the limitations of financialization. And we intend to really discuss this movement. But what's interesting is part of this process is that in 2016, when this company became the center of the corruption scandals, since 2016, what we have seen is a massive transfer of the ownership of these assets, these infrastructures assets, to international investors. This is just to highlight this far more important process, but this has been a really important tendency in most of the infrastructures holding by these large contractors. So we have seen now a completely different situation, And this it's about consider the development and all this transformation. It's about we're trying to develop our preliminary conclusions. What we see is that the crisis in a new model finance infrastructure has been put since 2017 with the another whole of BNDES and a massive transfer of assets to international and financial investors. So what we think that we could contribute is in this discussion how assetizations happen in a context of limit financialization, but it's in a movement of capture of value of many sectors of other sectors of the economy. But in the next phase, we could see a next phase of financialization. We see assetization, this preview assetization process, as a very important supply side for this subordinated financialization with the transfer of the asset to international, with the many initiatives to put forward more developable, more financialized infrastructure, and also to see how the interests about international investors are mainly concentrated in distress moment and crisis moment. So this is my contribution. I will really have to receive any comments, criticism. And this is the previous, our preliminary bibliography. I still doing a process of review. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Beatrice, for a very interesting presentation. And I would like now to give the floor to Daniel. Daniel, please.
Thanks a lot, Jerome. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you also for the Urban Studies Foundation and Joe Shaw for promoting this event. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, let me just put it to full screen. Okay, this is part of research that's been ongoing since more than a year now, and where I collaborate with Mayra Magnani, who is will start her PhD soon at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, and it's a research into the commercial real estate in Brazil, and particularly an attempt to build a typology of actors in this market and the consequences for urban development and urban outcomes. We just an overview of the presentation, this brief introduction, then the methodology of the ongoing research, a brief literature review, and the theoretical perspective we are following. And then I talk a little bit about institutional investors in Brazil and work on the typology of corporate landlords and present some of the preliminary findings. So just the introduction, there's been an enormous growth of REITs in Brazil recently, but this is part of a broader trend in the commercial real estate in the country since the early 2000s, with the decline in traditional forms of ownership like small individual investors, family-owned developers, and the rise of institutional ownership. So this calls for a better understanding of how these investors conduct investments in real estate. And the research project looks into the investment practices of these three groups of property investors in Brazil's commercial property markets, that is REITs, listed property firms, and pension funds. And the idea is that we intend to analyze key variables that explain the observed differences in investment practices, such as liability structure, governance models, and stakeholder participation in decision making, and to understand how this impacts into urban outcomes and territorial outcomes. And we claim that while these actors are all increasingly financialized, there remain key differences in investment behavior that deserve to be taken into account as I said, with potential implications for urban development and urban policy. Quick review of the methodology. We analyzed documents and specialized press material. We conducted semi-structured interviews with these actors. Participant observation with in those corporate events, and we've collected data on their portfolios in terms of value, types of property, and location. A brief contact with the literature. So property has emerged as an alternative investment in the portfolio of institutional investors and financial intermediaries recently. And the literature has shown that such corporate landlords, they exhibit a strong selectivity in favor of global cities when they build up their portfolios. Financial market rationalities have become more pervasive in the commercial property markets as a result of the presence of such investors. So we've witnessed the growth in new investment practices, new forms of governance, changing regional distribution of capital, and urban forms that reflect the expectations of these investors. The literature on urban studies often describes corporate landlords as a single type of investor guided by financialized metrics, but we believe that we can explore the different textures of capital and provide insights into how their differential power is wielded in urban scenarios. So we combine urban political economy and evolutionary and institutional approaches to economic geography, focusing on actors, their organizational routines, and their evolving institutional contexts, their networks of collaboration, which they use to share knowledge. And we understand decision making as territorially embedded and path dependent. A brief context of institutional investors in Brazil. They have grown in the amount of capital they have channeled to commercial property markets. So this is from 2019. It has already grown more, but REITs have around 180 billion reais in commercial property markets, and we have listed property companies and pension funds coming second and third in the amount of capital channeled to the urban to the commercial property markets. And REITs have been particularly it's been particularly remarkable, their growth in recent years, and even through the pandemic. So we have a steep growth both in the number of funds of REITs and in the amount of their net worth, including a growth in 2020. And then we reach the typology of corporate landlords in Brazil that we try to discern their differences in across all these 7 variables we found. So, for example, in terms of ownership structures, we have pension funds that are basically owned by plan beneficiaries. REITs have more diluted shareholding, but 80% of them are owned by individual investors. While listed property firms have a diluted shareholding, but are predominantly owned by institutional investors and some of them foreign investors. In terms of the liabilities they have, so pension funds are more long-term investors. They have long-term liabilities in the form of the payment of pensions, while REITs are more short-term. They have to pay dividends on a monthly or yearly basis. And listed property firms have a less predictable short-term in terms of short-term liabilities in terms of dividend payout, but also can rely on debt, issue debt, and this makes them different in terms of what they can do. So this is about leverage. Also, 2 of them cannot issue debt, while listed property firms are allowed to issue debt. In terms of manager discretion, that is how they are governed, how they are they are managed. We have pension funds where managers have some kind of limited discretion because they are subject to the fund's overall investment strategy, while REITs have a more variable, depends on the fund's regulation, the type of governance and shareholder participation. And listed property firms managers usually have a higher level of discretion. They can make decisions more freely, but they are also subject to market pressure in the form of the stock exchange. So this have some kind of has an impact on the kind of management of active or passive management. So pension funds have more limited active management, and while listed property firms have higher active management. Their position in projects, pension funds tend to hold majority control, while REITs are more variable, and listed property firms also prefer to take majority control to conduct, more extensive renovation and expansion of projects, and also, finally, their final the final aspects, they can rely on additional capital raise, and this depends pretty much on market conditions. In the case of pension funds, they're dependent on the fund strategy and the types of limits they have, and REITs and listed property firms are more dependent on the market conditions. So we try to build these variables, this table, exactly to try to get a sense of how these different actors operate in the commercial property markets, and the idea is that this set of variables explain the observed behavior of the institutional investors with regard to the strategy, the management preferences, and the time frame of their investments, and also a few differences in terms of the location and types of assets they have selected. So in terms of the strategy, we've found that property firms are more likely to engage in riskier ventures, such as large-scale mixed-use development, either greenfield or brownfield, including regions often considered less mature by other actors outside São Paulo and Rio, the largest cities. Pension funds have a more variable strategy that depends on the maturity of plants. In less mature plants, we have more brownfield development, and the opposite in mature plants. And REITs, because of their shareholding structure, where you have individual investors as dominant investors, REITs have predominantly focused on steady rental income, though. So they are more they try to provide investors with a continuous payout in terms of rents overall. So this is the kind of just a representation that's very common on economics textbooks, where we have a correlation between return and risk and four types of strategy. And then in terms of management strategy, both property firms and pension funds tend to take a longer term view of value extraction. So they tend to reach majority control of projects. They try to, manage directly, a hands-on approach to management of those projects. Pension fund, additionally, they prefer to share ownership with other pension funds because they see that they have a kind of common view of the real estate market, a long-term view. While REITs, they are more variable. You have some REITs that have a more passive ownership strategy, or they only collect rent, but some more recent REITs have a more active management strategy with a view to value extraction, and that depends pretty much on the kind of governance structure and manager mandates in these organizations. In terms of the time horizon of investments, pension funds tend to hold assets for longer periods, and me and Myra, we recently published a paper on pension funds specifically, while property firms and REITs are much more active in buying and selling property with a view to obtaining capital gains, sometimes short-term capital gains, and property firms often developed the assets that are then purchased by REITs for rental income. So property firms tend to be more focused on development, while REITs, for the reasons I already mentioned, they're more focused on rental extraction, rental income. And finally, in terms of location, we have noted that there are fewer differences between these actors. All of them are strongly skewed towards the largest cities in São Paulo and Rio. So that kind of generally confirms the literature, the international literature on REITs and other institutional investors, which tend to invest in large cities. But in specific segments such as malls, spatial dispersion is more common. In terms of the type of assets, large scale and Class A office buildings and shopping malls are predominant in portfolios, but logistics has recently experienced growth related to e-commerce, and specifically has been promoted by REITs. So these are the types of investments that property companies hold in large cities, or are usually mixed-use developments that combine shopping malls with office spaces. Pension funds are pretty much they own pretty much the same types of assets, usually malls, large-scale malls, or office towers. While REITs, we've seen, apart from the traditional, office tower in the right, we've seen this growth in the ownership of warehouses and other logistics infrastructure across the country, especially in the last 2 years. So where do we get from there? Of course, when we see those new actors taking hold of the commercial property market, we can say that financialization has become a more pervasive trend in Brazil, and this has been shown by several pieces of research that these actors, they use kind of financialized rationality, financialized sophisticated calculative techniques that enhance the extraction of value from property. But we think that despite these converging practices among these corporate landlords, we have to understand these different textures of capital that are tied to the institutional environment and the incentives these different actors have in shaping the urban and regional development in different ways. So it's important to say also that some investors, like property firms, they are more active in the property market. They tend to take a more leading role in developing greenfield property, and we have to understand what kind of city they are producing, and also understanding their different practices. It may help question also the tax incentives that have been granted to some of these actors, such as REITs, on the grounds of promoting urban development, while they are not necessarily promoting urban development, but generating more social and spatial inequality. Just to wrap up, just have to say that this is an ongoing research yet. So our intention is to analyze first how these investors interact among them, either as competitors or establishing a value chain, an investment value chain. Like you have the user demand, you have some investors that are more prone to develop new property, and then you have end investors that are focused on less risk. And also we have one branch of the research project, one key actually branch of the research project is to understand how these capitals get anchored in urban space, the types of projects they are favored, the negotiations with non-financial actors, the types of uses that are favored, and the effects on the local the local built environment. And here I have some of the reference I used in the presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your fascinating presentation on the different market players. Indeed, your work is very is a reference in terms of studying market actors, and so it's very interesting. And thanks to the discipline of all of you, we have been able to reserve exactly half an hour for question hour. So, and most of you have been sending, I think. Caio, for example, has one question for Dinora. He's saying, I was wondering, yes, it's coming up there. And while the other questions, like my proposal is to take a round of three or four questions and put them back to the presenters and see if there's time left for another round and final comments. So one is Caio, and in the meantime, while the chat is coming up, the questions, I have one question, a combined question for Beatriz, and also on linked to the Turkish case to Melih, is the issue of the state. While there's a lot of literature, of course, it's no surprise that the state is important. We all know this. But in the central countries, right, in the northern context, this is always like, okay, we have the state has to prepare for the private actors to come in and to smooth the path. But it seems to me that both the Turkish and the Brazilian case, we have a shift from the political economy to the economics of political economy to the politics of political economy, the importance of the state beyond economics. Like this was very clear in the Turkish presentation, but it seems to me that if you look at the recent Brazilian experience, the role of the national development banks like Caixa Econômica Federal and the BNDES, and the shift from outright privatization to public-private partnerships where the state continues to perform a role, and also the outright refusal, for example, in the state of São Paulo, where the state sanitation company Sabesp, although the secretary of the state claimed, okay, we're going to privatize the state company, but it's actually giving a lot of cash flow. So my question, both of you, is, are we sort of moving to an area where it's important to investigate the politics of financialization and state spaces of financialization? And maybe another question, I will take I will choose João Tunucu's question in order not to monopolize the debate. Can you pass on the question from João, Julia? He's asking, is the central government able to profit from land-based mechanisms through land taxes, development charges, value capture? How are these gains invested, disputed, or shared with local regional authorities? So that's it. We have basically questions for all of you. No, one also for to include also, and then we can finalize one round. Danielle, you have very nicely fleshed out the different actors. My question to you is, what is the role of non-state actors, which was also coming up in your conclusion and in your research questions? What is the role of the planning system in conducing these players? So maybe that's the first round. Okay, so who wants to start? Not everyone at the same time, please.
I can start.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Please.
I can start by answering the first question on the returns on investment. While I only analyzed the marginal returns on those prototypes, the overall returns on the investment depends on the velocity and the time that you could sell all these housing products, right? All these housing units, and so it's very variable. Sometimes, if the market is towards social housing, for example, like it was at the first stage of this financialization, obviously that gave larger gains as subsidies and other incentives diminished. That also diminished the gains on these particular products. And now, as a large demand for investment capital and investment in these larger development in these high-rise developments it's generating a boom. Well, that's generating a considerable gain on those assets. On the role of the land taxes, I can say that for the city of Tijuana, they're starting to implement these land capture values, but right now we are very limited on that aspect. So we practically don't have any land capture values, and whatever the government gets on permits, it's basically less than 1% of the whole municipal budget. So that's that part.
Melich, do you want to comment on my question, and afterwards Beatriz?
Sure. Well, I think it's a very important issue within the contemporary debates as well. I mean, we do see an enhanced state intervention and enhancement of the modes of state intervention in land markets and elsewhere in the economy as well. And what we see is not simply enabler or facilitator states, but states who actually drive who orchestrate the scene, this is also the case in terms of financialization as well, but also in other aspects of the built environment practices. So we see the states or state bodies, different state institutions acting as financiers, land brokers, builders, and so on, and also and they really orchestrate the scene in this sense, and this is, I think, qualitatively different from earlier tendencies. And I think this is also, of course, related with the other overall discussion these days, which is coming out very frequently these days in the debates, that of the state capitalism debate. And I think the dynamics we are talking about have to do with those. Although there are ambiguities and unclear issues regarding what state capitalism is about, or is it a right term to capture the tendencies today. But I think that's a really important topic. And the Turkish case, and I've been following the Brazilian case as well, but of course also the presentations here also gave me the impression that there are a lot of similarities. concerning these issues. Mia Casa Mia Vida is very much has certain dynamics that are very similar to TOKİ institution in Turkey. And in that respect, for instance, I think just one example out of the situation, the Turkish REIT scene, the real estate investment trust scene, is also expanding dramatically in the last 2 decades. And what is interesting more, I think, is that the REIT markets is almost unilaterally led by a firm that is actually that's an affiliate of a state firm of the TOKİ. So TOKİ has an own REIT, and which makes like almost 30% of the total market, and it is the driving institution within the REIT scene. It is itself leading the scene. So different dimensions in terms of financialization and also these public-private partnership issues. I think there is a much more and qualitatively different state strategy and state involvement that needs further exploration. And I think this is a very important dynamic. So I agree with that in general. Concerning the other question, well, the government is able to profit, but also sometimes channels the. It's a giver and taker in certain senses. In the last 2 decades, a very important change has been that TOKİ, this massive institution that is leading the construction drive, has actually also acquired the land reserves of that belongs to the public, to the state. And we're talking about huge reserves. The whole land portfolio that is not being commodified till then. It has been given to TOKİ, and TOKİ has been working like a land privatization bureau as well. And this was, of course, a very lucrative business, and TOKİ, through these land privatizations, could finance its policies somehow. They also got access to the for instance, not only like vacant public land outside of the cities, but also like former state factories in very valuable places in the cities, within city centers. And TOKİ also acquired the chance to take over those grants, and together with the REIT that it owns, they developed projects, of course, for most of the time for luxurious, both residential and commercial projects on these lands. So they could effectively privatize those. But if you look at the overall scene, I mean, another very common dimension of the current PPP scene, and which is also the subject of a political debate these days, is that most of the PPP arrangements for mega projects, for instance, rests on some kind of a guaranteed revenue for the contractors. So the state says, okay, you build the investment, the contractor takes this responsibility, and then in return for this, they are guaranteed a certain threshold of user revenue for that bridge, for instance, for that highway, whatever, or for also the airports. This is the usual stuff, and the actual usage is way below the threshold usually. So effectively, the treasury is paying these firms enormous amounts of money, and it's actually much more costly than if, for instance, a state body actually undertook this operation. This is a very huge debate, and just one of the huge debates within the political scene and around construction, actually. But it is a very, and the amounts are enormous concerning this, both for the airports and for the highways. The treasury is effectively paying out to these firms, and it's gonna last for like 20 more years, probably, most of them. So it is. It has both aspects. In one way, the tax is monetizing the land and using these resources for development. But in other aspects, the state is actually channeling money, channeling resources to these firms. So it's a two-way relationship, and it changed the different locations of different segments of the industry. And I think it's an important dimension of the overall increasing state involvement and different modalities. It's, I think, a very important discussion of today's contemporary capitalism. And I think we need further focus on these issues. Thanks for the questions.
I fully agree. It sounds very similar. Beatrice, please comment on this.
Yeah, no, I'd say that the Turkish case has a lot of similarities with Brazilian. I also have been talking with Özlem Selik, that we have many discussions in common. And thanks, Jerome, for the question. Make us to thanks a lot. I think your book helped us a bit with this discussion about the whole of the state. Certainly, we have to theorize and discuss more there, because certainly the whole of the state is different here in the global south or in the emerging economies than in the north. We are talking much. It's not only about enabling. It's sometimes a partner. It's sometimes someone who make the business more profitable. And it's interesting because I believe that infrastructure, these conditions, and even more visible, because in the real estate, the state will appear most in the financing, and then also in the infrastructure, they will appear also in the funding. This is this difference, that the fundings make the business function through the time. So the states remain subsidy the function of the infrastructure. And also this, I think this make us to see how the limitations of making infrastructures profitable in the global south, with all the lack of infrastructure, all inequalities. So I think clearly you put a question that makes me thanks a lot. But from the other hand, I think the history helps us a lot with this discussion, because as you see in the Brazilian case, in the industrialization, it's not the same pattern, because we are in another regime of accumulation, but the whole of the state in this industrialization process here in Brazil, it's incomparable of the whole of the state in the central. If we consider the whole that they take, how they became a holder in industrial project. So here in infrastructure, I think we have to go further. But also I'm thinking modern state companies and state, we need to go how this going together, how they are kind of partnered, how they associated, what this associated represent, how about the money that was transferred, because I think this idea of create some channels. So I think it's important to even to overcome this duality between productive and rentier. They are very together right now. And also trying to overcome this agenda that normally also dissociated with scholars that study state, they study the private sector, try them together. I think for our case, and also to discuss in rethink policies, it's quite important, bring together these two agenda of research. And thanks a lot. And it's also a pleasure to see all this very interesting presentation of my colleagues. Thank you.
Daniel.
Thank you, Jerome. This is a very good question. I think there are two ways we can think about it. We can think the way these actors, they have considerable leverage and power to shape the regulatory environment in which they operate. So I did a previous research on REITs and how they affect the framework of investment in this sector, and now we've been looking at how REITs are also involved, and this is not specific to urban planning now, what I'm going to talk, but they are involved in changing the rules affecting pension funds, so that pension funds channel money into REITs. So they have, in several ways, they have leverage to act in the regulatory environment at several scales. But also, I think that because they have a lot of money and a lot of they make large investments, there are cities and municipalities that are very interested in attracting this capital. So, for example, we've been looking at the city of Cajamar, which is, a municipality outside São Paulo, on the outskirts of São Paulo, that is, strategically located in the crossroads of major, roads that lead to the city. And we've seen that local governments have been very eager to attract capital into logistics, and to provide, benefits in the form of flexibilization of planning rules so that REITs, and other investors go into the city and build up new logistics infrastructure. And we've seen this in other cities too, but I guess that depends a lot on each city. So this is something we're only starting to look as we dive deeper into the specific projects and specific investments of each of these actors. So thank you very much for the opportunity and to discuss with everyone.
I'm looking at the watch. We have 9 minutes. So my proposal, if everyone agrees, is not to take another round of questions and to close down with last comments of each one of you makes in 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes, some last comments, and then we close. We wrap up, right, Joe? I give the floor to you, and we wrap up the session before taking. So I propose in the same order. Malik, please, not your last words, but your final comments for this session.
Okay, I think it was a very fruitful debate, and I think it's also a good opportunity to. It gave me some ideas for further work, and I think there is definitely more room for comparison within the global south. I think that's also an issue which is more emphasized during these days. I mean, recently, we usually tend to always compare and contrast with the global northern or advanced economies, but I think there is always room and also an important dimension for intra-global south comparison. My take-home lesson was this, actually, for this session. Yeah, I think that's a good way to end it. I would like to thank everybody again, and thanks for the opportunity, also the organizers. Yeah, good evening.
Thanks. Dinora, please.
Thank you everyone for this invitation. And I see that we are all talking of similar dynamics. Maybe I am talking more at the micro scale, at the decision of certain actors, while some of you are looking at the larger scale and the macroeconomics of it all. In all, I think this neo-liberalization policies implemented from these international organizations have territorialized very similar in all our nations. We have different governments, different schemes. Yet this new way of implementing, of giving markets this liberty to act, had to come with a counter, something to counteract them in the way of a democratic scheme implementation, which, as I see in our countries, has been quite difficult because our decisions in the institutional schemes are very path dependent. So in this sense, I believe we should start looking at things that could act as a counterweight, or if we can change these schemes through public policy in certain ways, and maybe look at the transparency of these actions, look at the accountability mechanisms that these actions are implementing, and also look at how local municipalities or local governments are dealing with capturing these land values and redistributing them within their local urban context. And that would be my take for this. And thank you so much. It was really a great interaction, and I hope to see you again.
Thanks, Dinora. Beatriz?
So thanks a lot. It is, as Dinora said, an enormous pleasure to be here, and I hope some points we could meet each other in person. I think Merli and Dinora highlight very interesting points. First is this idea of we have more South and South connections and reflections. And also I think it's a kind of challenge in my work that I'm, as an architect, used to work a very spatial scale, this idea of connect micro, meso, and macro level, and also, as we used to discuss in our group, global immediate dimension, and also a totality, because we have also a kind of a creation, as being discussed in another test. We have seen the acceptance of these dynamics that are quite abusive and quite complicated for the transformation of historically unequal cities. So I think to turn off this critical, also to highlight how this is so naturalized, how this is have so much of alienation of that, it's quite important in this challenge of go further in these investigations of this new dynamic and financialization, crossing the different levels. And also I've been studying a lot real estate, and I would say that I feel much more comfortable in real estate. I decided to start this challenge of infrastructure because for me, there are so many different, but at the same time, there are so many complementarities. And we have also this challenge, I would say, if we quite to craft an agenda, that also to make connections, not only about this, the big project, the big urban structure regeneration project, but also the indirect relations between infrastructure and real estate. So I think this today we bring a lot of contributions in terms of the scales and dimensions, in terms of how maybe to improve this connection south-south, and how to cross infrastructure and real estate dynamics to more understand our cities and to more understand how to could struggle with this process and all this consequence and impact of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Beatriz. Please, Daniel.
Thank you. I'm just going to reinforce what Otto said. I mean, the importance of the South-South conversation, and thank the Urban Studies Foundation to, provide this space for our debate. I think the Global South tend to be, segmented by our language communities, and we tend to be debating with our peers in the same country or Latin America. But I think with, the Urban Studies Foundation is helping us to broaden the arena of debate, and we can discuss with other scholars in the Global South, and find that there is a lot of diversity in the Global South in terms of political structures, in terms of cultural traditions, and this affects also the kind of outcomes we see in urban and regional production. So I'd like to thank again for the opportunity to discuss with my colleagues and to the Urban Studies Foundation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. For my part, I would like to thank all of you who have been participating, assisting, and sending questions through the chat system. It has been very nice, and I'm sure this is going to be a first from our part, from the UFABC, together with the Urban Studies Foundation. I hope it's going to be the first of a series of similar events. And having said that, I pass on to Joe for closing our event and stick within the 2 hours we agreed.
Thanks, Jeroen. So I'll just keep this short and sweet, but thank you to all our speakers for the fascinating talks and the discussion at the end, and to UFABC for making it possible. Thanks to Jeroen for chairing, and also, of course, to Julia and Isabel for the organisation. As Jeroen just said, this is only the second of these workshops that we've held for the International Fellows. We definitely will be holding more, including perhaps one day in person. We'll see about that. So please stay tuned via the website, mailing list, and social media. Also, if anybody who's here today in the audience wants to know more about the USF and their grants, please don't hesitate to get in touch directly with myself if you have any questions. You can do that via our website, urbanstudiesfoundation.org. And finally, thanks to everybody for attending, and have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, indeed, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.